Oh, doing some Israel.
Zionist pig!
Yikes.
Yikers.
Snikers. All right. CNN.com. About 160,000 people protest against Netanyahu's judicial overhaul in Tel Aviv. Now, I haven't been following every detail of the protests here. I was trying to catch up a little bit on it last night. But 160,000 people is a lot, considering Israel as a nation has a little over 9 million. So we're talking, almost 2% of the population protesting.
Yeah,
so that's a lot
crazy.
of people upset. And I was trying to figure out what they're upset about. The CNN article does give a little bit of an outline. Of course, it's CNN, so keep that in mind. But I also have another article from MSNBC that I think is worth your attention. It says here, about 160,000 people demonstrated in Tel Aviv Saturday night against the Israeli government's plans to weaken the country's judicial system. Crowd expert Ofer Grinboim-Leiron told CNN. That would make it one of the biggest single demonstrations yet against the legislation. Grinboim-Leiron, the CEO of Crowd Solutions, which specializes in crowd dynamics at events and venues, based his estimate on drone photos at 8 p.m. local time. I don't know how he got those drone photos. Is it his drones? Is it somebody else's drones? It doesn't say. But just as a side note, you go to the iCrowd, the Crowd Solutions website. I think we've talked about this company. It rings a bell, iCrowd. And what they do is, on the ground, under control, if you go to their services page, they provide event CCTV. They have medical solutions, radio communications, meteorological solutions, event consulting, event command staff, world-class event control centers, bonded cellular live streaming, event and brand risk reduction and mitigation. It gets really in there. Dispatch and event loggings, incident management software, Suez drone video. Maybe that's where they got the footage. Emergency phone system, and onward. They are just a great tool, I guess, if you know you're going to have a crowd. So I thought it was interesting that they would be contacting, or CNN being they, quoting someone from this particular company that controls, or not controls necessarily, but assists in crowds. Just thought it was funny.
Yeah. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it says your organizers...
Sounds like a job for AI.
Yeah, you're going to be replaced there, guy, Grinboim-Leiron, unless maybe Grinboim-Leiron is AI. Organizers of the protests said an additional 130,000 people protested in other demonstrations across the country Saturday night. Numbers from organizers have been higher than estimates from independent experts, such as Grinboim-Leiron. Tel Aviv and other cities around Israel have been seeing regular Saturday night demonstrations against the judicial overhaul plans for 8 weeks. This has been going on for weeks. So here's CNN's summary of what's happening. The package of legislation would give Israel's parliament, the Knesset, the power to overrule Supreme Court decisions with a simple majority. It would also give the government the power to nominate judges, which currently rests with the committee composed of judges, legal experts, and politicians. It would remove power and independence from government ministries as legal advisors and take away the power of the courts to invalidate, quote-unquote, unreasonable government appointments, as the High Court did in January, forcing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to fire Interior Health Minister R.A. Derry. I'm sorry, I'm messing that up. R.A. Derry. So basically, it's this whole thing with Netanyahu trying to come in, and according to him, he's sort of doing a cleanup job. But according to
is he back in charge now?
He kind of is. Yeah, it's a weird. There was a technicality, and yeah, I think he's at least in charge of one of the governing arms. So
sounds like a pretty intense takeover move.
It's very complicated. And again, I went down the rabbit trail last night, and it's impossible to really cover every detail, unless you're covering Israeli politics. It's hard to, see the history and the details and everything else. But AP also reported mass protests in Israel as controversial overhauls advance. And same thing. There's a Supreme Court override bill that Netanyahu's trying to push through. And there was an interesting language here from AP. The Supreme Court override bill's approval in a preliminary vote in the Knesset was the latest step by Benjamin Netanyahu's ruling coalition towards realizing the judicial overhaul that is steaming ahead despite calls for dialogue and consensus from American Jews and Israel's president and the weekly mass protests. Okay, so we got to have American Jews agree with it, or I guess what? Not good? In addition to weakening the country's highest court, the protesters say the proposed changes threaten Israel's democratic values and concentrate power within the ruling coalition in parliament. Netanyahu and his ruling coalition believe the court has had unchecked power for years. And again, the CNN outlined it as well, where, Netanyahu says the lawyers had way too much power in the government and stuff like that. And maybe he's trying to pull that back. Again, I don't know who's telling the truth or what side is the better ethical side. It's just all very confusing. I think it's kind of meant to be that way. However, I think the greater thing to point out here is from this article from MSNBC. And the headline, "The U.S. made the right move against Russia. It's time to do the same to Israel." And yeah, this is, I think, where we're headed with this. Okay, so we know the AOC and the progressive liberal Democrats don't necessarily like Israel, so it's not really a surprise in that context. But I think pushing forward the narrative through mainstream media is a next level thing, where we may be seeing, we talked about the Balkanization of America and really not just within, but kind of the deglobalization taking place. Well, it's possible that a lot of alliances or pre-existing alliances, sort of the post-World War II type of alliances may start breaking up, and that's part of the preparations here. But here's the article from MSNBC. On Wednesday, the Israeli military invaded the Palestinian city of Nablus in the occupied West Bank, killing at least 11 Palestinians and injuring scores more, which... Look, the reports about Palestinians and Israelis dying on the West Bank, and it's been an ongoing issue for a long time, so no surprises there. But it was the deadly occupation by another military power that consumed much of the West and its media's attention, just as Israel was once again raiding Palestinian territories. President Joe Biden was returning from a secretive trip to Ukraine, celebrating and honoring the country's heroic resistance to Russia's year-long war and even longer illegal occupation. As we reflect on the one-year anniversary of Russia's deadly invasion of Ukraine, we should be encouraged by an example of the U.S. standing up to an occupier, pledging support and honoring those on both sides of the battle. Both sides. Imagine that. Who have paid the ultimate price in the course of a devastating conflict. But the contrast of international response to Ukraine versus the occupied territories in the West Bank proves once again that in the eyes of the West, and specifically America, not all illegal occupations and military invasions are the same. In Ukraine,
interesting.
Yeah, in Ukraine, resisting occupation is celebrated, and its struggle is heralded as a fight for freedom. Western governments have shown they are prepared to send billions in aid, heavy weapons, tanks, and sophisticated weaponry to repel and defeat Russian aggression. But when the American ally is Israel, the U.S. is funding and protecting the occupier, equipping it with sophisticated weaponry and billions of dollars in U.S. taxpayer money to maintain its brutal and oppressive control of Palestinians. When Russia annexes Ukrainian territory, the U.S. and the West rightfully condemn it and mobilize international fora to reject such moves. When Israel moves to expand and build Jewish outposts on occupied Palestinian land, the U.S. blocks international efforts to hold Israel accountable. This week, the United Arab Emirates initially considered a UN Security Council resolution condemning Israel's plan to build Jewish settlements. The resolution would have called on Israel to immediately halt and withdraw all settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. But that resolution was tabled when it appeared the U.S. was going to shield Israel by vetoing it. Instead, the resolution was swapped in favor of a non-binding U.S. Secretary Council statement that said the body expresses, quote, deep concern and dismay over Israel's plans to expand settlements. It goes into some of the, a little bit more of the history, people dying and whatnot over the conflict. And then it gets into the Israeli government about, the protests happening now. And it says here, so dangerous is the right-wing government that Israel's opposition parties and thousands of Israelis for weeks have been protesting proposed changes to the country's judiciary, sounding the alarm about the country's future. So again, it's very interesting. If you want to compare it to United States politics, it is sort of the Trump, Biden, left-right thing, where maybe Trump will come in and try to clean up some of the mess of the whatever part of the U.S. government. And then you see a mobilization of the people saying, no, you're going to ruin democracy and all that kind of stuff. And painting it as all this dangerous right-wing government and trying to take over everything. Very, very complex issue as expected.
Well, it's interesting because it's not, it's kind of like a type of thing.
Right.
Wow. U.S. government hypocritical about, trying to.
It's duh for us. But for MSNBC readers, it might be like, their heads might explode.
The question, the real sort of, sticking point with this is, you're right, to the average reader who, let's just say they're all in on Ukraine, and now are faced with a sort of...
Because those are the same people calling out, the anti-Semitism is getting horrible in this country, and the racism, it's the same folks who peddle that kind of narrative. So when it comes to Israel, it's always been a touchy subject. It'll be interesting to see how they respond, because it's like, well, if you don't like Russia, then why are you supporting Israel? But then if you do that, are you being anti-Semitic? Brains exploding. So it's a very interesting move.
Gotten themselves in a little pickle, haven't they?
Yeah, and I think it's part of, again, it's the divide and conquer methodology we always talk about. I do want to mention this right here. Quote, I'm very worried about what Netanyahu is doing and some of his allies in government and what may happen to the Palestinian people. Senator Bernie Sanders said in an interview with CBS News' Margaret Brennan. Quote, and let me tell you something. I haven't said this publicly, but I think the United States gives billions of dollars in aid to Israel, and I think we've got to put some strings attached to that and say you cannot run a racist government. This has been a talking point for Bernie for a long time, but I think it's interesting that for the first time they're presenting it in the context of the war in Ukraine and Russia, and the good guy, bad guy narrative. Oh, what's Israel? They're kind of being the bad guy, and if you're going to use the template of the Russia-Ukraine war. So this is I'm just going to keep an eye on this and see how this develops, because not just in Israel, sort of the changes taking place potentially, but also how America's relationship with Israel looks, because obviously it sounds like, we're going to continue protecting Israel. And this is also a very a challenging sticking point for a lot of American evangelicals who are 100% all in with the, help the nation state Israel narrative. So a lot of different angles here.
My mind goes directly to, well, how does this serve the China narrative? And we have seen actually Israel taking some pro-China stances recently. They start making some what is it called? Didn't they start trading oil in the yuan or something, or they were considering accepting yuan instead of the US dollar? This is probably just posturing type of stuff, but it's tough because you have Israel, who's kind of has been taking Russia's side in Ukraine.
Well, yeah, they haven't gone full anti-Russia like the West would like them to do.
But it has been frustrating to the U.S. government, the way that Israel has not been supporting the Ukraine situation in the way they'd like. And it's kind of like, because Israel is, kind of doing their own Ukraine situation with Palestine.
Well,
so who's to say, it'd be kind of weird for them to, come to the defense of Ukraine while they are, pulling, at least in the view of this article, a similar situation on Palestine.
Right.
But but then also Israel mucking up the clean lines when it comes to China as well is going to really start putting U.S. support of Israel to the test.
It's going to be very interesting. And we reported on this article from the Jerusalem Post years ago. I don't remember if it was actually when it was published, but the article is from the Jerusalem Post titled China's Belt and Road Initiative, What's in It for Israel. This was published in January of 2018. Okay. And it talks about how there's, some cost benefits to Israel supporting the Belt and Road stuff with Israel, because they kind of sit in a spot where, they can make some money, maybe, getting all that stuff from the east over to the west, helping out to build out the Belt and Road, or at least helping facilitate it. There's some benefit to them as a nation to comply with the Chinese in this project. So
yeah, economically, it's a huge benefit.
Yeah, so that's already been there, and maybe the U.S. doesn't like it or something. I don't know. Israel's cheating on U.S. with China.
I mean, I think we said those exact words when we were talking about it last time.
And I did leave some resources in the not the description, the show notes for anybody who's interested. And again, these are resources. I'm not saying these are all factual things here, but there is a Princeton.edu article titled "A Constitutional Coup in Israel: Background, Causes, Consequences." Anytime you get into academic literature about Israel, you find a lot of information, but man, is it dense. There is so much written about it in just thousands and thousands of pages. It's really hard to wade through. It's a never ending sort of thing, but it's a topic that we don't bring up often on the show, but we have in the past, and I wanted to revisit it in the context of the country in turmoil and perhaps changing or seeing some changes in policy, not just within, but with the relationship with the U.S. and how that might foreshadow a potential Trump presidency in 2024 to 2028. He comes in, he starts moving things around, and what is that going to do for our international relations and all that kind of stuff. So,
yeah, interesting.
Yep.
Okay, we'll keep an eye on it.